couldn't believe my eyes. My new garden shed was completely destroyed, and the alleged culprit was none other than Karen from the HOA. Every plank was smashed, tools scattered everywhere, and my precious plants uprooted. If you were me, how would you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. I'm Alex, and today you'll see how I fought back. Stick around because things are about to get wild. Trust me, it's personal. I bought this house, certain I'd found my personal paradise. A tranquil suburban cul-de-sac where I could indulge my passion for gardening and finally nurture the seeds I'd been dreaming of planting. My first mornings were spent testing soil quality, plotting out rows for tomatoes, cucumbers, and herbs. Neighbors seemed pleasant enough at a glance, friendly waves exchanged under the calm hush of well-maintained lawns. Yet, amid that peaceful facade, there was Karen, president of our local HOA, whose gaze hovered over every blade of grass. I remember how I initially brushed off her curious stares. After all, I wasn't hurting anyone by adding a few raised beds. But the lingering way she'd stand on the sidewalk, arms folded, phone in hand, unnerved me more than I wanted to admit. Jordan, my neighbor 2 doors down, warned me early on that Karen thrived on micromanaging. He recounted endless examples: a woman forced to remove her wind chimes because they didn't fit the approved look, a family fined for planting ornamental grasses deemed too tall, a young couple scolded over Christmas lights that blinked. The stories sounded absurd. I figured if I stayed within guidelines, matching my paint colors, ensuring the yard was tidy, I'd avoid any trouble. For a while, that optimism held. Karen would only offer the occasional pointed comment about how I might want to consider flowers that aligned with the neighborhood palette, or ask if I'd consulted the rules about installing a small trellis for climbing peas. Perhaps it was her job to care, I thought. She headed the HOA. Maybe that meant she liked consistency and neatness. I wasn't looking for conflict. Growing up, I'd seen enough petty disputes to know it was better to keep your head down and stay cordial. But the day I decided to construct a modest garden shed in the far corner of my backyard signaled the start of real friction. Despite carefully checking the guidelines, approved paint colors, the maximum allowable height, the correct setback from property lines, I received a letter from Karen within a week stating I was in violation of the community's aesthetic rules. When I reread her note, I nearly laughed. It referred to something about the shed's roof angle not matching the overall neighborhood style, which I found baffling. Yet there it was, in black and white, a polite but firm insistence that my structure had to be taken down or modified to comply immediately. The letter ended with a line about potential fines if I chose to ignore the notice. That was the first official sign that Karen was more than a casual busybody. Jordan dropped by with a sympathetic grin the day I got that letter. He told me not to panic. According to him, many of Karen's warnings contained half-truths or references to guidelines twisted for her convenience. He'd once been fined for noise pollution because his toddler was crying in the yard, a claim so outrageous that he contested it and won. "You just have to push back," he said, munching on leftover pizza I had in the fridge. Karen isn't used to people challenging her. I mulled this over, uncertain if I wanted to start a war with the HOA president. At that point, I figured I'd simply respond politely and provide copies of the official HOA architecture rules. I did that within the week, highlighting paragraphs that validated my shed's compliance. For a short while, nothing happened. Then the second letter arrived, more forceful than the first, citing an entirely different rationale. The shed's color was unacceptable because it was visibly distinct from my house. This was nonsense. I had chosen the same paint brand and color code used on my exterior walls. I could only assume she'd changed tactics when her first angle failed to gain traction. Feeling the stress mounting, I phoned Karen directly, leaving a calm voicemail explaining that the paint was indeed identical to my home's. She never returned my call. It all might have ended as a mere bureaucratic annoyance if I hadn't noticed Karen skulking around my yard on multiple occasions. I'd catch glimpses of her after dark, flashlight in hand, snapping photos, probably for her evidence file. Once I spotted her leaning over my fence, muttering to herself. She scurried off as soon as I opened the back door. I considered calling the police, but Jordan again advised caution, suspecting that Karen would spin any complaint into me harassing her. The tension grew heavier in my chest with each new day, like a slow-building storm I couldn't quite see. I tried to refocus on positive projects, sowing seeds for herbs, adding compost, experimenting with new irrigation methods. But the sense of intrusion wouldn't fade. Then came the formal fine notices, amounts per day for non-compliance. I read them in disbelief. How is this real? I had a permit for the shed, technically not even required but recommended, and I'd verified the HOA's color guidelines. Still, I was apparently racking up fees by the day, all sanctioned by Karen. I reached out to the board members listed on the HOA's website, hoping someone else could intervene. Responses trickled in. One board member was out of town, another insisted that I handle it with Karen directly, and the rest didn't reply. Jordan guessed that Karen had them under her thumb, or they just didn't want the headache. Meanwhile, relatives from another state kept urging me to just tear down the shed, keep the peace, but that felt like giving in to a bully. I finally decided I had to gather evidence of my own, suspecting that Karen might escalate. Jordan wholeheartedly agreed. He even suggested I install a couple of outdoor cameras around the perimeter of my yard, so I did. I aimed them at the corners, ensuring the feed covered the shed as well. If Karen ever trespassed or tampered with anything, I'd have proof. Paranoia set in deeper than I liked to admit, but having cameras gave me a small sense of control in a situation that felt maddeningly lopsided. Karen wielded the HOA rulebook like a club, and I needed at least some way to protect myself. For about a week or two, life quieted down. I thought maybe the cameras had deterred her. Then, on a cool Wednesday evening, everything changed. Coming home from work late, I flipped on my backyard lights and stared at a sight so shocking it took me a moment to process. My garden shed, the same one generating all the controversy, lay in ruins. Walls ripped apart, splinters everywhere, potted plants knocked over, and potting soil strewn across the lawn. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, swallowing a surge of anger and disbelief. No mere windstorm could have caused this. Someone had demolished it. Adrenaline surging, I opened my phone's camera app to record the damage, then switched to the security feed. A series of motion-stimulated clips waited, time-stamped around 8 p.m. With trembling fingers, I tapped the first clip. Darkness filled the screen until a figure came into view, shining a flashlight. The figure wore a dark hoodie, but I could see glimpses of her face when she turned. My blood ran cold. It was Karen. Her expression intense, her hands gripping a crowbar. The next clip showed her yanking boards from the side of the shed, the crowbar's metal edge prying and tearing. A third clip revealed her standing amid the wreckage, pausing to glance over her shoulder before resuming the destruction. I felt rage and vindication collide. She wasn't just threatening me. She'd gone and committed a blatantly criminal act on my property. I stood in shock for what felt like an eternity, replaying those few seconds of footage that put her guilt beyond doubt. My first instinct was to rush to her house, pound on her door, and demand an explanation. But Jordan's voice echoed in my head. Document everything, don't do anything rash. So I saved the clips to the cloud, made copies, and texted Jordan telling him what happened. He arrived within minutes, eyes wide with disbelief when he saw the debris. We watched the videos together in my living room, both of us alternating between silent outrage and bursts of incredulous laughter. Who would do something so blatant? Jordan insisted we schedule an emergency HOA meeting. If she thinks she can just smash your property and walk away, she's out of her mind, he said, pacing my living room. I agreed wholeheartedly. This wasn't a petty fine, it was vandalism, possibly felonious if the damage value was high enough. We both anticipated that Karen would deny everything, so I made sure to back up the footage on multiple drives. My next step was to email the entire HOA board requesting an immediate hearing. I attached a still image of Karen mid-swing, crowbar raised. I kept the message brief, stating the time of the incident, the nature of the destruction, and the identity of the culprit. By midday, the board responded, scheduling a special session for that very evening. The speed of their reply hinted they realized the gravity of the accusation, or maybe they wanted to contain the scandal fast. Either way, I spent the afternoon drafting a clear statement, detailing how I'd complied with every known rule, how Karen had fined me unfairly, and now, how she'd escalated to destroying my shed. I could barely eat lunch. My stomach churned with equal parts dread and anticipation. The evidence was on my side, but I had no idea how the rest of the board would react. Karen held influence, and she'd likely try to spin events in her favor. Jordan came over again, helping me print screenshots at different angles. He also reminded me to remain calm during the meeting, something I suspected would be difficult. I'd lost something precious to me, not just in monetary terms, but in the sense of security I'd felt at home. My yard was supposed to be my safe haven. Now it felt violated, trashed by the very person meant to uphold community standards. When evening arrived, I drove to the community center, documents in hand, pulse fluttering. Outside the building, small clusters of neighbors huddled, whispering about the emergency meeting. Their stares landed on me momentarily, some with pity, others with curiosity. I pushed through the doors, trying to project confidence. The meeting room was already packed, murmurs swirling around the fluorescent-lit space. At the front sat the board, a semicircle of chairs. Karen occupied one end, arms crossed, jaw tight. As soon as we made eye contact, she looked away, scowling at the floor. Mark, the board's vice president, started the proceedings. The usual formalities were dispensed with quickly. He turned to me. "You requested this meeting, Alex. Please explain what's happened." My throat felt dry, but I launched into the story, building my shed in accordance with guidelines, Karen's repeated objections, the fines, and finally the recent act of vandalism. I ended by handing out the screenshots, ensuring everyone could see Karen holding the crowbar, the remnants of my shed around her. A chorus of gasps rippled through the room. Karen shot to her feet, claiming I'd faked or manipulated the images. She babbled about invasion of privacy, accusing me of illegally filming her. I stood there, stunned by her audacity. She made it sound like she was the victim. Mark, to his credit, asked me to confirm how I'd installed the cameras. I explained they were on my property, pointing at my yard, well within my rights. Jordan chimed in, referencing local regulations that permit outdoor security surveillance. Karen's supporters, if she still had any, shifted uncomfortably. The evidence was too clear. Even those loyal to her would look foolish denying the images. An older neighbor, Mrs. Clayton, spoke next, voice trembling with frustration. She revealed how Karen had harassed her over potted flowers that supposedly clashed with the HOA's color scheme. Others chimed in about receiving threats for minor issues, painting a pattern of intimidation. Karen looked cornered. She insisted she was only doing her job, implying we all misunderstood her intentions. Then someone asked bluntly, "But how do you explain that crowbar, Karen?" Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Mark sighed. "I think we have sufficient grounds for a formal vote. Karen, until this matter is fully resolved, I propose that you be removed from your position as HOA president." Murmurs of agreement flowed. Karen sputtered, but the board members one by one raised their hands to support her immediate removal. I nearly sagged with relief. It was a swift downfall for someone who'd wielded so much power for so long, but I also realized it was only a beginning. The question of property destruction extended beyond HOA rules. She might be legally liable for everything she'd done. A few neighbors suggested I press criminal charges. Even Mark, who usually seemed neutral, said, "You have clear video evidence. We can't let this slide." As I left the community center, Karen stormed out, knocking chairs aside, refusing to look at anyone. A hush settled among the neighbors gathered in the corridor. Then they turned to me with sympathy. I heard murmurs that I should get the police involved, that I might be able to claim damages. My head spun with all the advice. I was exhausted and still reeling, but deep inside a flame of resolve burned. Karen had crossed the line. This wasn't about a minor dispute over garden aesthetics anymore. I intended to take every legitimate step to hold her accountable. The next morning, I felt a jumbled mix of triumph, fear, and emotional fatigue. Karen's dethroning was significant, but my shed was still destroyed and I had the weight of possible criminal proceedings ahead. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from neighbors, many thanking me for finally exposing her. Some quietly admitted they'd been afraid to speak up due to Karen's relentless fines. Jordan dropped by again, urging me to file a police report as soon as possible. He was right. I needed an official record. Gathering the video clips, I headed to the local police station. My palms sweated as I handed over a flash drive with the footage, explaining how my property had been vandalized and showing them still shots of Karen mid-attack. The officer listening to me remained calm, nodding and asking clarifying questions. He seemed particularly taken aback by the clarity of the images. After all, it's not every day you have footage that perfectly captures the person wrecking your property. He told me they'd open a case and keep me updated. Walking out, I felt drained but also oddly empowered. I had done something concrete. The following days were a whirlwind of phone calls, evidence gathering, and awkward run-ins with neighbors who were either curious or wanted to share their own Karen horror stories. Some told me about her showing up unannounced to measure the length of their lawns. Others mentioned receiving cryptic letters about bird feeders being unsightly. It was as though the entire neighborhood had endured her tyranny for years, only now feeling safe enough to speak out. This outraged me further. How could someone exploit a position meant to foster community for personal vendettas and controlling behavior? Meanwhile, the new interim HOA board stepped in, led by Mark. They rescinded the fines Karen had imposed on me, praising my patience and apologizing for the unfortunate breakdown in leadership. Though the official gesture was nice, it didn't restore my shed. My property was still littered with its broken remains, a daily reminder of how far Karen had gone. Insurance was a question mark. Some homeowner policies included coverage for vandalism, but the bureaucratic hoops looked daunting. Also, the damage might exceed certain coverage limits. That meant I might have to sue Karen for the difference if she refused to make amends. Each afternoon, I'd clean up fragments of wood, nails, and roofing, trying to salvage anything usable. Tools that had been stored inside were ruined, a wheelbarrow's tire slashed, a rake snapped in half. The losses added up financially and emotionally. That shed symbolized my commitment to turning the backyard into a personal retreat, a place where I could cultivate produce and share extras with neighbors. Seeing it reduced to rubbish felt like an assault on my dreams. My mood swayed between raw anger and a low, simmering sadness that occasionally caught me off guard. Jordan watched me pick up shards of plywood one day, softly suggesting we start planning a new shed. The idea momentarily felt overwhelming. Could I move forward without closure on Karen's wrongdoing? He gently reminded me that building anew might be the best therapy. I appreciated his optimism, but I also recognized my own need for justice. Karen hadn't just inconvenienced me, she'd committed a literal crime. I wanted her to feel the repercussions of those actions. An unexpected wave of support rolled in from other neighbors who offered to help rebuild or chip in for materials. It was heartening to see how quickly a sense of solidarity emerged once Karen's chokehold was lifted. People volunteered their weekends or offered spare lumber. They'd stand in my yard shaking their heads at the destruction, sharing jokes to lighten the mood. If anything good came from this, it was the renewed sense of community. Maybe we were forging a better bond by collectively rejecting fear. Not everything was rosy, though. Karen still lived a few streets away. I spotted her car occasionally, though it seemed she left at odd hours, perhaps avoiding direct confrontations. Rumors suggested she might be trying to gather a legal defense or shift blame. A fleeting thought crossed my mind. What if she tried to retaliate again? My cameras were still up, capturing every angle of the property, but the notion of her creeping back unnerved me. Each night I double-checked my locks and felt a surge of anxiety at the slightest rustle in the yard. The day the police detective called was a turning point. He explained they had enough evidence to treat this as a criminal vandalism case. Karen would be contacted for questioning and potentially charged. The news triggered relief, but also dread. A criminal case could drag out, requiring me to testify. Did I want to put myself through that? I asked if there was another route, maybe a settlement. He shrugged, saying it depended on Karen's cooperation. If she admitted guilt and paid restitution, we might avoid a lengthy process. But if she dug in her heels, the case could escalate. I relayed all this to Jordan, who strongly believed Karen needed a lesson. She's been terrorizing people for ages, he said. Letting her off easy might mean she never fully grasps how wrong her behavior was. I couldn't argue with that, but part of me was tempted to just get restitution for my shed and be done. The bitterness was wearing me down, yet I also realized the communal significance of standing up to her. Others had suffered silently. Perhaps my example would embolden them to reject intimidation. The new HOA board held another meeting soon after to address broader issues: how to prevent one person from amassing that much unchecked authority. They invited me to speak about my experience. Despite feeling nervous in front of a crowd, I agreed, hoping transparency might prevent future abuses. I recounted the entire saga: the endless fines, the contradictory letters, the silent standoffs, and finally the devastating act of vandalism. Standing at the microphone, I noticed people nodding sympathetically, some with tears in their eyes. When I finished, they applauded. In that moment, I sensed a collective determination to ensure no one would ever replicate Karen's methods. Mark announced new policies to streamline dispute resolution, requiring multiple board members to review complaints before issuing fines. He also proposed mandatory community courtesy workshops for board members, an idea met with scattered laughter and applause. It was a small but meaningful shift toward a more cooperative ethos. A neighbor whispered that we should rename the local dog park after me, jokingly calling me a hero for taking down the HOA tyrant. I laughed it off, though the sentiment warmed me. I certainly didn't feel heroic, just stubborn enough to demand fairness. Days stretched into weeks, with no sign of Karen personally contacting me. Mark mentioned in passing that she was suspended from all board activities pending the legal outcome. Some neighbors saw her scowling from behind drawn curtains, presumably furious at losing her power. I heard rumors she might be planning to sell her home and leave. I had conflicting emotions. Relief at her departure mingled with anger that she could just escape the mess she created. But the police process chugged along, and I recognized that criminal records don't vanish simply by moving away. In the meantime, life regained some normalcy. I resumed my gardening projects in a smaller capacity, focusing on container plants and reusing the unbroken pieces of wood as makeshift planters. The yard no longer felt as haunted, especially with supportive neighbors checking in. Jordan and I joked about having a big shed-raising party once I was ready. My mood lifted each time I looked out the window and saw the sun shining on the open space where the old shed once stood. This place was still mine, no matter what Karen had done. Eventually, the detective called again, informing me that charges were likely to be filed. He wanted me to confirm the extent of the damages for the record, so I tallied the approximate cost of rebuilding and replacing tools. It was a sobering figure, more than I expected. I faxed over receipts and estimates, imagining Karen's reaction upon seeing the financial consequences of her rampage. Would she try to negotiate, deny everything, claim I forged the videos? The uncertainty weighed on me. Yet I reminded myself that every frame of footage was crystal clear. Mark and the new board assured me they'd coordinate with the appropriate channels to expedite any restitution Karen might owe. Meanwhile, neighbors continued voicing their support, some quietly hoping she'd face actual jail time. I wasn't convinced it would go that far. Typically, first-time offenders in property damage cases might get probation or community service, assuming they paid compensation. Either way, I was determined not to let her slip away unscathed. On a random Thursday afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Karen showed up at my door. I'd just finished watering some seedlings when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw her standing there, arms stiff at her sides. My heart thumped uncomfortably, but I opened up, bracing myself. She looked haggard, eyes sunken as though she hadn't slept in days. Before I could speak, she blurted, "I came to talk about a settlement." There was no apology in her voice, just a certain desperation. I invited her in, albeit reluctantly. She refused a seat, standing near the doorway. She handed me an envelope containing a typed statement, offering to cover a specific sum for my shed, tools, and emotional distress, provided I dropped the charges and agreed not to pursue further legal action. I skimmed the contents. Her offer might have covered most of my immediate losses, but it didn't acknowledge her blatant law-breaking. "Is this an admission of guilt?" I asked, scanning the text. She twitched slightly, muttering that her lawyer advised her to handle it quietly. I felt a stab of anger. After all she'd put me through, she wanted to throw money at the problem without a real apology. But I also understood that a swift resolution would spare me a drawn-out court case. I told her I'd think about it, feeling a mix of disdain and relief. She nodded curtly, turned on her heel and walked out. The entire encounter lasted maybe 5 minutes, leaving me oddly unsettled. She still exuded the arrogance I'd grown to despise, yet she was clearly cornered. When Jordan heard about her offer, he was livid. "Don't let her buy her way out," he insisted. "She deserves real consequences." But he also acknowledged that if I wanted to move on with my life, settling could spare me more headaches. A legal fight might consume months. I was torn, knowing I'd also have to coordinate with the district attorney if formal charges were already in motion. Time dragged. I spoke with a friend who worked in legal aid, asking if a settlement would hamper the criminal case. She explained that I could handle the civil side by settling, but the state could still press charges. My acceptance of restitution wouldn't necessarily halt the prosecution. That news actually calmed me. I could recoup my losses and still let the law take its course. Perhaps that was the best outcome. Karen would pay and possibly face further repercussions from the authorities. 2 days later, I phoned Karen to say I'd accept her settlement only if it fully compensated me for the damage and included a written admission of wrongdoing. No ambiguous regret if you were inconvenienced nonsense, but an acknowledgement that she'd vandalized my shed. She sounded furious, but eventually agreed, likely under pressure from her lawyer. We arranged the details through official channels, ensuring a paper trail. The final document she signed did, in fact, concede she was responsible for destroying my property and that she intended to pay me in full. I nearly smiled at the irony of Karen, a woman who once lorded over every petty guy line, being forced to sign off on her own guilt. With that settled, my mind felt freer, but the criminal investigation still loomed. I wasn't going to intervene one way or another. That was the state's decision, and if they pursued charges, so be it. In the meantime, the new board followed through on their promise to help me rebuild, along with an enthusiastic group of neighbors. We planned a weekend shed raising, reminiscent of old barn-building traditions. People arrived with hammers, saws, and a sense of camaraderie that stood in stark contrast to the tension Karen had cultivated. I realized then how much negativity one individual could bring, and how quickly positive energy could fill the void once that influence was removed. Over the course of 2 days, we framed a new shed, installed stronger beams, and finished it with a fresh coat of weatherproof paint. Standing back, I marveled at the results. It wasn't just a replacement shed. It was a testament to collective goodwill. I felt a wave of gratitude for everyone who pitched in, reaffirming that the essence of a neighborhood should be collaboration, not control. When the final board was nailed into place, we all stepped back, sweaty and tired, exchanging smiles. Jordan took a photo of me standing next to the new structure, grinning. It felt like a significant victory, not just over Karen, but over the fear that her tyranny had spread across this community. That night, we celebrated, ordering pizza and turning the whole thing into a laid-back party. Someone joked about sending Karen a snapshot of the new shed, bigger and better than the old one, just to rub it in. We laughed, but decided against it. We didn't need to stoop to her level. Our best revenge was simply thriving. I woke up the following week with a lighter heart, even though the memory of my ravaged shed still stung. The new structure in my yard felt like a symbol of resilience. Every time I stepped inside, I recalled the many hands that had hammered nails, sawed timber, and painted walls, all to help me out. My gardening tools hung neatly, shining in the early sunlight. For once, I felt that sense of peace I'd initially sought when I moved here. Rumors about Karen's status circulated. Some neighbors said they'd seen a for sale sign on her lawn, while others heard she was holed up inside, hardly coming out. The HOA, under Mark's leadership, held a public meeting addressing multiple issues that had been swept under the rug during Karen's time in power. They mentioned exploring changes to the bylaws to prevent future abuse. Things like requiring multiple signatures to approve citations or rotating presidency rules to discourage entrenched authority. At that meeting, more neighbors than ever stood up to share personal tales of Karen's harassment. One older man recounted how she'd threatened fines if he didn't remove a small decorative statue from his porch. A single mother described receiving a warning because her kids' bikes were temporarily parked on the lawn. It was astonishing how she'd twisted trivial infractions into threats. Listening to these stories, I felt both anger and validation. We weren't alone, and we'd collectively broken free from her intimidation. The new board vowed to fix the system so nobody could replicate her methods. Meanwhile, the police case inched forward. The detective informed me Karen had been formally charged with misdemeanor vandalism, potentially carrying fines or probation. I kept track of the proceedings from a distance, having already provided my statement and video. She pled not guilty at first, but I suspected her lawyer might push for a plea deal. Even if she avoided jail, the official record would stand. Plus, she'd lose a chunk of money in penalties. Part of me felt that outcome was fair enough. She wouldn't just waltz away unscathed. A week passed, then two, during which I settled back into my gardening routine. My tomato plants thrived, peppers sprouted plumply, and I discovered a surprising joy in replanting the flower beds Karen once criticized. Neighbors would occasionally drop by, praising the new arrangement or asking for tips on starting their own raised beds. I found myself relishing these interactions in a way I never had before. A sense of fellowship flowed through the community, as though we were collectively healing from a long period of tension. Jordan teased me that I should run for the HOA board. After all, I'd inadvertently galvanized folks by standing up to Karen, but I just laughed. Serving on the board was the last thing I wanted. My aim all along was to garden in peace, not to step into the same seat she'd misused. Mark and the others seemed more than capable of steering the HOA toward more balanced leadership. One afternoon, I encountered Karen purely by accident in the local grocery store. She stood in the produce section examining apples. My stomach tightened, but I took a breath and tried not to let anger overtake me. She noticed me, her eyes flitting away immediately. I sensed shame in her posture, a stiffness that betrayed how uncomfortable she felt. For a second, I pondered whether to approach her, maybe to say something pointed. In the end, I just grabbed my items and walked on. She offered no greeting, and I didn't push. There was nothing left to discuss. She was no longer my concern, and I had no desire to rehash the past. Still, the emotional residue lingered. Late at night, I'd replay the moment I discovered my demolished shed, how my heart had thudded in my ears, how violated I'd felt. Even though I'd rebuilt and secured a settlement, the memory flashed back sometimes. Trauma leaves its mark. I considered talking to a counselor, but the busyness of life kept me distracted. Thankfully, working in my garden provided a measure of therapeutic calm. Pulling weeds, pruning stems, and feeling soil in my hands grounded me more than any formal therapy session might have. Jordan, noticing my occasional dips in mood, suggested we organize a neighborhood gardening club. He argued it would be a fun way to channel the positive energy swirling around now that Karen's hold had dissipated. When he floated the idea at the next HOA gathering, people seemed genuinely interested. We set up an informal club, planning monthly meetups in different backyards to swap seeds, share tips, and generally celebrate the horticultural joys that had been overshadowed by negativity. The first meeting was at my place, a cheerful event where folks arrived with potted plants, brownies, and plenty of laughter. During that gathering, a retired couple confessed they'd almost moved out of the neighborhood due to Karen's unrelenting nitpicking. Now, they felt rejuvenated and grateful they'd stayed. A young family described how anxious they'd been about playing with their kids outdoors, worried a squeak of a swing set would prompt another fine. Hearing these tales made me realize how pervasive Karen's intimidation had been. Yet ironically, her downfall had unified us more effectively than any HOA flyer or seasonal event ever could. We were forging a new sense of belonging. As the club meeting wound down, people drifted into smaller groups, chatting about everything from composting techniques to the best local nursery for seedlings. I stood in a corner sipping lemonade, watching neighbors who once avoided each other strike up animated conversations. Mark approached, patting me on the shoulder. He thanked me again for being the catalyst that exposed Karen's behavior. I offered a modest shrug, insisting that I didn't want credit. "I just defended what was mine," I said, meaning every word. In truth, though, a part of me recognized how my stand had lit a spark. Without those videos, Karen might have continued unchecked. Maybe the board wouldn't have believed me if I just claimed she'd torn down my shed. But seeing her in the act, crowbar in hand, left no room for denial. She'd undermined her entire authority with that one reckless move. And in doing so, ironically, she set the stage for the transformation we were all witnessing. Despite the relative calm, small ripples of the incident persisted. A local newspaper picked up the story in a short column, describing how a once feared HOA president was removed following evidence of vandalism. They didn't name me, but folks around town connected the dots. A couple of times, strangers approached, asking if I was the guy who took on the HOA. I'd nod, uncertain how to respond. My only real wish was to return to a life where I could garden in peace without public recognition. Karen's for sale sign did appear eventually, confirming she planned to leave. The sign lingered for months, though, suggesting a slow sale. Perhaps prospective buyers caught wind of the controversy, or maybe she was pricing her house too high. Whatever the reason, her presence remained a ghostly shadow in the neighborhood, even if I rarely saw her in person. Part of me pitied her. She'd lost her standing, faced legal trouble, and become the local villain. That was a steep fall for someone who once seemed unstoppable. I still remembered the first time I heard her voice, that polite but condescending edge telling me that my garden might reflect poorly on the community. Such arrogance. Now that voice was silent. In a fleeting sense, I felt a pang of sadness for her unraveling, but I quickly reminded myself she brought it on herself. If she had approached me politely about any concerns, if she had agreed to meet halfway, none of this would have happened. Instead, she escalated until she committed a crime. I didn't hold illusions of total closure. After all, life rarely offers tidy endings. But as the new board firmly grounded its policies, as neighbors opened their yards to each other, as kids played freely outside, I sensed we'd emerged from a heavy fog. My yard, once overshadowed by conflict, felt like a sanctuary again. The newly built shed stood as proof that destruction could be followed by reconstruction, both physically and spiritually. Jordan teased me that I should commemorate the whole ordeal, maybe by framing a still shot of Karen with her crowbar. We shared a good laugh, but decided it was better to move on, letting the memory fade. The cameras still watched over my property, though. I figured better safe than sorry, even if I doubted Karen would ever try something that brazen again. On a late afternoon, while watering my tomato plants, I noticed a patch of fresh wildflowers blooming near the fence. It struck me how nature moves on, unstoppable and resilient. It felt symbolic. Even after a storm, growth returns. I crouched down to touch the petals, thinking of all that had happened. Sometimes we need a jolt. Something that forces us to confront wrongs, to reshape our environment for the better. That's exactly what Karen's rampage did. It tested our neighborhood, forcing us to unite, adapt, and grow past her tyranny. By nightfall, I found myself sleeping more soundly than I had in months. Even the distant memory of the smashed shed didn't rouse me. I was beginning to see the bigger picture. As awful as Karen's actions were, they also revealed hidden strengths in me and my neighbors. We discovered we could rally together and stand firm against misuse of authority. Now, a new sense of possibility colored my everyday life, a feeling that what we'd built, both physically and communally, was stronger than one person's malice. Summer ended, yielding to the crisp onset of fall. Leaves turned vibrant shades of orange and red, fluttering across lawns that once had to match Karen's rigid specifications. The new HOA leadership introduced a series of neighborhood events, barbecues, holiday decorating contests, even a communal yard sale. People participated with unexpected enthusiasm, as though freed from an invisible chain. In the midst of all this, I continued fine-tuning my garden, proud to showcase my new shed to anyone curious. I never asked for a perfect outcome, but life felt close to it. We had our share of everyday issues, overgrown bushes, dogs barking, but they were handled with polite knocks or friendly emails, not punitive letters or stealthy visits. The sense of mutual respect reawakened my belief in communal living, something I'd lost during Karen's oppressive reign. The best part, I finally glimpsed the friendly suburb I'd originally thought I was moving into. One crisp evening, I invited Jordan over for a laid-back dinner to celebrate the bumper crop of tomatoes I'd harvested. As we sipped on iced tea, conversation drifted back to the Karen fiasco, as we jokingly labeled it. He asked if I ever regretted not pursuing a harsher penalty against her. I admitted sometimes I wondered if letting the court system handle it all might have given her a more fitting consequence, but truthfully, the settlement, combined with her public disgrace, felt sufficient. She wasn't in a position to hurt anyone else through the HOA, and if the state decided to proceed with charges, that was on them. Jordan nodded, acknowledging the sense of closure that came with finishing my new shed. Plus, he added with a grin, we can always show neighbors the videos if they doubt you. That made me laugh, though I doubted anyone in the community needed reminders. Karen's downfall became local lore, an emblem of why petty tyranny never prevails in the long run. A few days later, Mark knocked on my door, brandishing a small plaque. The board, in a gesture of thanks, had crafted a Community Spirit Award. He wanted to give it to me, highlighting how I'd brought everyone together by standing up for my property rights. The plaque itself was simple, just a wooden plate engraved with my name and the date. I felt a flicker of embarrassment, insisting I hadn't done anything extraordinary. Mark chuckled, saying that sometimes doing the right thing, even if it's just defending your own corner of the world, can have a ripple effect. I thanked him and decided I'd hang the plaque inside the new shed as a quiet reminder that adversity can spark unity. In the background, Karen's attempts to sell her house dragged on. Every so often I saw prospective buyers parked outside, presumably touring. A neighbor hinted that Karen had lowered the price multiple times. Perhaps word of her behavior was traveling, or maybe the housing market was just slow. Either way, I felt removed from the drama. She'd done her worst, and the community was forging ahead without her influence. Eventually, a moving truck appeared. One afternoon, I glanced out my window to see furniture loaded, boxes stacked on the curb. A strange pang hit me, some odd mixture of relief and pity. Karen had effectively been exiled by her own actions. That alone felt like punishment enough. I wondered if she'd learned any lesson from this ordeal, or if she viewed herself solely as a victim. I supposed it no longer mattered. She was leaving, and we'd all remain behind to cultivate something better. When the truck pulled away, I watched through a gap in my fence, noticing Karen seated in the passenger seat, staring forward without looking back. The old me might have waved or attempted a final confrontation, but I stayed hidden. She was a chapter this neighborhood had outgrown. I felt a quiet hope that in a new place she might reflect on her mistakes, though I wasn't naive enough to expect it. Time rolled on. The legal case ended with Karen pleading no contest, receiving a fine and mandatory community service, ironic for someone who once supervised a community. While the story made minor headlines in the local paper, the general reaction was shrugs and jokes about how karma caught up. I heard from a friend in the district attorney's office that she'd argued for leniency, citing personal stress, health issues, and so forth. It didn't surprise me. Everyone has their reasons. But you don't get to wreck someone's property and walk away scot-free. With Karen gone, the road ahead looked bright for the neighborhood. The board passed new guidelines ensuring a fair review process for complaints. My neighbor's kids started a lemonade stand without fear of random fines. Porch swings and garden statues popped up. People relaxed, planting the flowers they liked, painting their doors cheerful colors. Tiny expressions of individuality no longer suppressed by rigid mandates. It was a refreshing transformation, like a reawakening of creativity. Personally, I redoubled my efforts to cultivate a thriving garden. My tomatoes were plumper, my herbs more fragrant. I arranged a small greenhouse where I experimented with seedlings year-round. Folks from a few blocks away came by, curious about my methods. I discovered a hidden passion for teaching, explaining the nuances of composting and proper watering. A sense of pride swelled within me each time I saw someone else's garden flourish, partly thanks to tips or cuttings they got from me. That was the neighborly spirit I'd hoped to find here all along. Whenever I stepped into my new shed, I'd pause at the plaque Mark gave me. It reminded me of how far we'd all come from that night of sabotage. The memory still stung occasionally. The raw shock of seeing the splintered boards, the creeping fear that someone had invaded my refuge. Yet the sting gradually dulled, overshadowed by the knowledge that I hadn't surrendered to the darkness. I had cameras, evidence, and the will to fight. I'd demanded accountability, not just for myself but for everyone who'd been quietly oppressed. I found myself occasionally reflecting on the power of one person to shape or distort a community, and how quickly that power vanishes once people unite against it. Karen's departure underscored the idea that no single individual could dominate if enough neighbors stood up and said no. The cameras were the catalyst, but the real strength came from collective action. Jordan's unwavering support, Mark's fair leadership, and the neighbors willing to share their experiences. It was a mosaic of small efforts combining into a formidable stand. Looking back on everything, I realized that the entire ordeal, awful as it was, forged unexpected bonds. People who barely greeted each other now planned barbecues and gardening clubs. Maybe that was the silver lining. Karen's behavior, monstrous as it felt, brought about a reckoning that ultimately cleaned house, so to speak. I could walk around the block now and see an array of personal touches. A bright door here, a whimsical mailbox there. Details that expressed individuality without fear of retribution. On a brisk fall day, as I removed spent vines from my beds, Jordan stopped by to deliver homemade cookies. We stood in my yard, munching on chocolate chips, marveling at how a single year could transform everything. "You did good," he said, slapping my back. "So did you," I replied, appreciating how he'd stood beside me at every turn. We gazed at the new shed, the greenhouse, and the yard that once lay under Karen's dark cloud. Now it shone under the golden autumn sun. Free. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. Life would carry on with its usual problems, bills, occasional disagreements, repairs. But the dread I once felt, wondering if Karen would hit me with another letter or show up unannounced, was gone. In its place was a cautious optimism. We had faced adversity and emerged stronger. The official conclusion, as far as I was concerned, was simply this: a community that chooses transparency and unity cannot be held hostage by anyone's iron grip. That night I pulled up an old photo on my phone, an image of the original shed taken before Karen's rampage. It was simpler, smaller, but I recalled the pride I felt building it. Now I had a sturdier structure, a symbol of renewal. In the background of that old photo, I could faintly see her silhouette on the sidewalk, arms crossed as she stared at me. In that moment, I almost thanked her for pushing me to prove my resolve and, in the process, uniting the neighborhood. Then again, I wished we could have found a kinder resolution. Still, lessons often come wrapped in conflict. In the end, my story was one of confrontation and perseverance, yes, but also of neighborly unity. I hope that if anyone hears it, they remember how crucial it is to stand up for what's right, even if the antagonist seems invincible. Had I caved, had I quietly torn down my shed, Karen would likely have continued bulldozing others' spirits. By filming her every move, by demanding accountability, I helped break that cycle. And now I can finally do what I set out to do from the start: cultivate my garden, share my produce, and cherish the peace in a place I call home. Because this is my sanctuary. This is where I choose to plant new seeds and watch them thrive. No matter who tries to stop me.